Well, good evening to everyone. Very nice to see so many people here. The talk, Vietnam and Cambodia in the Cold War and afterwards, is a very broad area. Naturally, I have to select certain aspects, and I was told also to focus on implications for Southeast Asia and to ASEAN of the main developments in the Indochina Peninsula. This is basically the plan of the lecture. Before the formation of ASEAN, just a brief background, there was the Cold War, which began in 1947. It was between the West on the one side and the Soviet Union, and later China on the other side. Cold War means you try to weaken or destroy the other side without direct military conflict, by economic warfare, psychological warfare, proxy wars, starting insurgencies in the allies or the friends of the other side, by all these means. So some people say maybe there's a Cold War starting now between China and the United States. I would say not yet. It hasn't gone to that stage yet. So the Cold War, it went on from 1947 to 1989 or 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it was already ending before the collapse of the Soviet Union because Gorbachev changed Soviet policies. Now, there was a second Cold War in the 1970s and 1980s. That Cold War was mostly in Southeast Asia and East Asia. That was the Sino-Soviet Cold War. There was a Cold War going on between China and the Soviet Union from the 1970s to about 1990. Now, decolonization in Asia. This started in Southeast Asia. The first country to be decolonized was Burma, now called Myanmar. After that, we had Indonesia, 1949. Then we had Malaysia and Singapore. Actually, the first one was Philippines, 1946. Now, decolonization, the colonial powers left, and there were successor local governments. Now, in all the countries we are talking about, well, only Thailand did not have colonialism. All the other Southeast Asian countries had. Now, there were nationalist movements in all these countries who wanted independence. And they got their independence from the colonial powers in Burma, in Malaysia, in Malaya, Singapore, Philippines. In Indonesia, they had to fight a war with the Dutch before they got their independence. Now, Vietnam and Indochina, especially Vietnam, were the only country in Southeast Asia where the nationalist movement had already been taken over by the communists. By the time the colonial power came back. So when the French came back to Indochina, they found that the nationalists who wanted independence were actually the communists. So the French didn't want to give up their colony. A war started between the French and the Vietnamese nationalists under Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist and a member of the Comintern. Now, the war ended in 1954 with the French losing, and there was the Geneva Peace Agreement in 1954 which settled the outcome of the war. half of Vietnam was given to the Viet Minh, the Vietnamese nationalists who were also communists, half. The other half was kept as non-communist South Vietnam. So you had North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Vietnam was divided into two parts. Now the Vietnamese communists were very unhappy with this because they thought they had won the war. So why didn't they get the whole country? And they were quite resentful of the fact that China, who was their supporter, as well as the Soviet Union, put pressure on them to accept the division of Vietnam into two. So they had no choice but to accept the division. And of course, there was a clause in the Paris Peace Agreement that after 2 years, there will be elections in the whole of Vietnam. And that will decide who rules the whole country. But the anti-communist government in the South Vietnam and the Americans did not want the elections, because the elections would have been, because this was the time of the Cold War. You know, the US did not want the expansion of communism in Southeast Asia. So there was no election, and by 1960, the North Vietnamese made the decision to absorb South Vietnam by force through insurgency, guerrilla warfare, including sending their own troops into the south. ASEAN was formed in 1967. Let me give you an idea of the security situation in 1965. 1965 was a year that Singapore became independent. Now, the security situation in Southeast Asia in 1964, first half of 65 was very bad. Here, of course, in Singapore, the government was preoccupied with domestic problems because there was very high unemployment, economic problems. There was also a local communist problem. But outside, you know, when in 1965, Indonesia's confrontation against Singapore and Malaysia was still on. But outside Singapore and Malaysia, the situation was bad. In Indonesia, the Communist Party of Indonesia was very strong. And Sukarno, who was the president, was sympathetic to them and supported them. And the Communist Party of Indonesia and Sukarno, President Sukarno, by 1964 had very close links with Communist China. So there was a great worry that the whole of Indonesia might become communist. So that was to the south of us. To the north of us, after North Vietnam made the decision to try to take South by force through subversion and insurgency, including sending in North Vietnamese troops in disguise, there was a great fear that Vietnam and the whole of Indochina will also collapse to the communist forces. So we will have in Southeast Asia a communist thrust from the north, which will endanger Thailand, and if Thailand is endangered, then Malaysia will be endangered, and the south, you know, another. So there was a great worry at that time. That's why I said anxiety. By late 1965, there was some relief. Relief because in the summer of 1965, the US decided to intervene in the Vietnam War by landing its ground troops in the summer in Vietnam. So here we all felt, okay, if the communists eventually take over, it won't be so soon, because now they are being resisted. And in the south, there was a coup. There was a failed coup by left-wing forces in Indonesia. It failed, If it had succeeded, the communists would probably have taken over eventually. Instead, it failed, so the military took over under Suharto. So on both fronts, there was relief by the end of 1965. ASEAN was formed in 1967. Although by that time, there was some relief, as I said, the Southeast Asian countries, I think this was initiated by Indonesia and Malaysia, decided that they should come together because after the experience of Indonesian confrontation, the new government in Indonesia, which was more pro-West, although non-aligned but sort of pro-West in ideological sympathies, it was felt that with all the communist threat around the region, we Southeast Asian countries should not be fighting each other. We should concentrate on cooperation and economic development, because the best weapon against communist subversion those days. You see, nowadays you may not think how serious this is. In those days, communist subversion was very serious. There were assassinations in Singapore, in Malaysia, bombs and all that. The best way of fighting communism was economic development, and not to fight among ourselves, because if we fight among ourselves, the communists will just take advantage of our weaknesses. So that's why ASEAN was formed, mainly because, number one, because of the communist threat, number two, because of the experience of confrontation and the great economic weakness of Indonesia, because Sukarno had ruined the economy. So the new government realized they needed peace and cooperation if they wanted to revive the economy. So ASEAN was formed for these reasons. But ASEAN also had another goal or motive, and this was particularly desired by Indonesia and Malaysia, but it was accepted by the other countries. They wanted to manage. You see, Southeast Asia has always been interfered in by outside major powers. All through history, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the French, and then Japan, and then later the US, China, all the outside big powers are into. So Indonesia and Malaysia in particular wanted to insulate Southeast Asia from big power rivalry. Very difficult actually, So the Malaysians said, let's have neutralization. We have a treaty with all the outside powers, the major powers, to say that Southeast Asia shall be neutral. And all the big fellows have to sign that so that they don't interfere in Southeast Asia or don't bring in their forces into Southeast Asia and so on. But Indonesia objected to a hard treaty for neutralization because Indonesia felt that these people who sign the treaty, the big powers, if you make them sign, they're already involved in Southeast Asia. So let's not have that, because then they have a role once they sign, see? So ASEAN just had a declaration that Southeast Asia will be neutral. Although it has never happened, but we still have that declaration, and it's one of the ASEAN rights. It's always there in the ASEAN literature. So that has also been important. And in fact, when ASEAN was formed, the first meeting, when the foreign ministers of the 5 countries met to form ASEAN, this took place in Bangkok. Indonesia and Malaysia did not want foreign military bases in Southeast Asia and foreign alliances with foreign powers. But then at that time, Philippines had an alliance with the US, Thailand had an alliance with the US, Singapore and Malaysia had alliances with Britain. So that was a no-go. In fact, I understand Mr. Rajaratnam threatened to walk out if this was seriously implemented. So this has remained a wish and a long-term desire, but in practice it has been difficult to implement. Vietnam War. As the war dragged on, security anxieties in Southeast Asia again rose, because it looked as if the Americans wanted to fight a limited war. They didn't want to go and invade North Vietnam or even cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, and they were having difficulties in fighting an insurgency war. Not so much difficulties, but not, of course, military difficulties, but more important, political difficulties at home in the US, because the American public wondered, what the hell was this war for? So in February 1968, the Vietnamese communists, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, launched the Tet Offensive, Tet the New Year, Vietnamese New Year, in which simultaneously so many cities of Vietnam were attacked. Now the Vietnamese communists lost very heavily in the Tet Offensive, in terms of manpower, which was actually a military disaster for them. But it made a tremendous impression on the US public. Anti-war movement grew. Subsequently, when later some Vietnamese generals were interviewed after the war, they said the war was not going well for us. That's why we staged this offensive. So we were very surprised about the effects it had and how fast we won after that, when the Americans got tired of the war. So there were these anxieties. Will Vietnam fall to the communists? What will happen to Thailand? There were these worries in Southeast Asia. And then there was, of course, the domino theory, which was the reason why the Americans entered the war in the first place, because there was a widespread belief at that time, especially in the US, that if Vietnam goes communist, then the communists from there will subvert Thailand. And Thailand will have no choice but to accommodate to communist powers, and then what about Malaysia and Singapore? So that was the theory. And that was the reason why the Americans intervened in Vietnam in the first place. Now some scholars say, now on hindsight, that this proved to be rubbish because, after the Vietnam War ended, nothing happened to Thailand, nothing happened to the other Southeast Asian countries. They all remained non-communist and nationalistic. But I think that is wrong. I don't agree with this view, because if Vietnam had turned communist in 1965, 66, 1967, it would have been dangerous for the rest of Southeast Asia. When they became communist in 1975, the world had changed. Southeast Asian countries had 10 years in which to build up their economy. They were much more resilient. And secondly, within those 10 years, Sino-Soviet relations became bad. So the two main communist powers were at very serious odds with each other by the time the Vietnam War ended, and soon afterwards. So when the Vietnamese and with the backing of the Soviets invaded Cambodia, China supported the other side, so there was a new balance of power. This wouldn't have happened 10 years before. Now, economic benefits of the war. There were economic benefits for countries like Thailand and Singapore. Mainly, well, the American war machine bought a lot of petroleum from Singapore, but these were from British and American oil companies for their aeroplanes and helicopters and their vehicles. So that was one. Secondly, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam, and each contingent, I think, fought for only 6 months or 1 year, then they were rotated. So you can see how many people were moving through. And after 1 year, after the term was over, they would have rest and recreation. In Thailand, Singapore, the hotels will benefit, the services industries will benefit, so like that. There were some benefits. That's why later, when Pham Van Dong, the Prime Minister of North Vietnam, after the war was over, visited Singapore, he told Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, you must give us aid because you sided the Americans and benefited from the war, And so the North Vietnam and the Viet Cong won the war because the Americans decided to withdraw. They came to a settlement with North Vietnam. I think it was the Paris. This also was a Paris peace agreement. 1973, it was concluded, but the Americans decided to withdraw. The Americans have built up quite a strong South Vietnamese army. But US Congress was so much against the war. After 1973, they cut off military aid to South Vietnam, even the giving of supplies and weapons, So morale collapsed. So when the communists attacked, it was very strange. 500,000 strong army just collapsed. When the North Vietnamese, of course, had a very professional army. So at that time, when that happened, there was a lot of security anxiety in Southeast Asia because Vietnam had a huge military machine. They boasted a 1 million man army, and they claimed they had defeated the world's strongest power. And they made threatening noises to the rest of Southeast Asia. On hindsight, I can understand them, because after all, Thailand provided air bases for the Americans to bomb North Vietnam. The other countries of Southeast Asia, including Singapore, Philippines, were also supportive, although we were not directly involved with any way. So the Vietnamese communists, when they were in charge of the whole country, they made statements like, we are the vanguard of socialism in Southeast Asia, meaning we are the first country in Southeast Asia to be communist, but we are the first and there'll be others. We are the vanguard of socialism. And then they also said things like that it's only a matter of time before other countries of Southeast Asia liberated. Liberated means turn communist. Liberated from neocolonialism, and things like that. So Radio Hanoi was always spouting this kind of propaganda. So that made the Southeast Asian countries even more nervous, that what is going to happen? Because there was no more balance. Before that, the Americans could come in and be a balance to the communists. But the Americans had left. They were not going to come back because their public opinion was totally against any. So there was, who was going to balance the Vietnamese military power? Vietnam's intentions were betrayed by the sorts of statements they made. But on hindsight, maybe they had no serious intentions about invading Thailand, all that is possible. But I think they would have tried to subvert Thailand, if they had been left, if there had been no counterbalance to them. And I have extracts from this is to show what we saw, Southeast Asia saw is the arrogance of the Vietnamese. This is from Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, He says the Vietnamese cunningly exploited the fears and desires of the countries of ASEAN that wanted to befriend them. They talked tough over the radio and newspapers. I found their leaders insufferable. They were filled with their own importance and prided themselves as the Prussians of Southeast Asia. True, they had suffered all the punishment that American technology had inflicted on them, mostly bombing of North Vietnam, and through sheer endurance, plus their skillful propaganda, exploiting the American media, defeated the Americans. They were confident that they could beat any other power in the world, even China, if it interfered with Vietnam. For us, the puny states of Southeast Asia, they had nothing but contempt. They saw them as, saw all the states as corrupt and pro-Western, that kind of thing, They declared that they would establish diplomatic relations with the member states of ASEAN individually and refused to deal with ASEAN as a group, and so on. And then another from the same chapter, that night as I walked with the Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Van Dong to dinner, he again said that Vietnam could not trade because Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, let's trade. Vietnam could not trade but needed help. Singapore had benefited from the Vietnam War, selling the Americans war material. Hence it was our duty to help them. I was dumbfounded by this arrogant and belligerent attitude. So that was the arrogance of Vietnam. You see, Pham Van Dong visited Southeast Asia, if I remember correctly, I think I do, before Vietnam invaded Cambodia. This was to prepare the ground so that there won't be too much opposition. The effects of these events on ASEAN. There was so much worry about what will happen after communists won the Vietnam War and they made so many threatening noises. There's a lot of worry. And it was this worry which led ASEAN to come closer together. Because before this, ASEAN had their annual foreign ministers meeting, but there was not much else. But because of the anxiety over Indochina, ASEAN for the first time decided to hold a summit meeting. All the top leaders of ASEAN, Suharto, Lee Kuan Yew, at that time was Tun Razak perhaps, I can't remember who was the Malaysian, in Bali, Indonesia. And they signed a number of important documents. One was called the ASEAN Concord. Another one was the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. The Treaty of Amity and Cooperation was in relations between members of ASEAN. No country will use force or threat of force to solve problems, to solve bilateral problems. And this had to be signed by all the countries. And the hope was that we try to bring in Vietnam and they will also sign it. But Vietnam did not want to join. If you look at the documents of this ASEAN Concord, you'll see that for the first time, ASEAN talks explicitly of having political cooperation among ASEAN members. This was not there in the ASEAN's founding document, the Bangkok Declaration. At that time, ASEAN spoke only of economic and cultural cooperation. They tried to avoid political cooperation. But now, because of developments in other parts of, security problems, new security problems, it was decided that ASEAN countries should come closer together to be more united. And also, ASEAN decided to have, around about this time, dialogue partners. We decided to bring outside powers, mostly at that time Western powers, Australia, New Zealand, European Union, US, because otherwise we are alone. Because of the threat from the north, we at least politically, it gave a good impression to have other outside powers supporting us. So we started having dialogue partners for ASEAN. So the adverse security developments helped to bring ASEAN closer together. Oh yeah, another major development of at that time was the boat people. Hundreds of thousands of people left Vietnam. First, there was the ethnic Chinese, because Vietnam and China relations deteriorated badly, and the ethnic Chinese were ill-treated in Vietnam, so they left in large numbers. And they were not well treated. Many of them had to pay money, whatever savings they had left, to the Vietnamese authorities before going. I think there were, I don't remember the exact number, maybe 200,000 or more, even more. And some of them left by boat because of some reasons, and to find a home in other countries. But the majority of the boat people were ethnic Vietnamese. They were the poorer types, who were leaving because of hardships and bad conditions in Vietnam. And ASEAN countries suspected that the communist government of Vietnam was not stopping them from going, and in fact maybe instigating them to go, and which was posing a huge burden on Southeast Asian countries, because many of these boats came to the shores of Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, crowded with people and without food, and we had to supply food, and they wanted to come in. When Singapore is too small, we could not allow, but we provided food for them to sail on somewhere else. But Malaysia took in, 70 or 80,000 or 60,000 in refugee camps. So, in fact, things became so bad because we didn't know when this would stop. How many more would come. So, some of us in Southeast Asia began to suspect that Vietnam was deliberately trying to destabilize the region by exporting the unwanted humanity, So that was a big thing those days. But from 1976-77, Vietnam-China relations deteriorated. I don't know what's my time. I think I have to go faster a bit. Vietnam-China relations deteriorated. In fact, the outflow of ethnic Chinese from Vietnam, many of them went to China, was a symptom of the deterioration of relations. Because at this time the Khmer Rouge were ruling Cambodia. They were backed by China. They were very anti-Vietnam. They persecuted they persecuted all the Cambodians also, but they persecuted the Vietnamese minority in Cambodia, and they were constantly engaging in border provocations against Vietnam. A lot of incursions, and China was supporting them. So in 1978, I suppose Vietnam just got fed up and invaded Cambodia to remove this regime. Now, maybe the way I presented it is sympathetic to Vietnam, but the Southeast Asia did not see it that way. So they invaded Cambodia in 1978. Yeah, December 1978, and set up what we call a puppet government of Cambodians. And that resulted in China attacking Vietnam in February 1979. It was a punitive attack to punish Vietnam for its attack for its invasion of Cambodia. So, when Vietnam invaded Cambodia and occupied Cambodia, again there were huge security anxieties in the rest of Southeast Asia, especially Thailand. Thailand was very worried because then you had Vietnamese forces on Cambodia's border, on Thailand's border. So they were very worried as to what will happen next, whether the Vietnamese will invade Cambodia or support the invade Thailand or support the Thai Communist Party. So a lot of concern, and there was a concern in the other ASEAN countries too. So that was the time when ASEAN became still closer together. Adverse security situations in Southeast Asia tended to bring ASEAN closer together. ASEAN decided through diplomacy, to try as much as possible to delegitimize Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia. They succeeded in preventing Vietnam from getting the puppet government to occupy Vietnam's seat in the United Nations. So all through, the seat in the United Nations for Cambodia continued to be occupied by the Khmer Rouge representative. The Khmer Rouge government was called the Democratic Kampuchea government. So they kept on occupying that. ASEAN, together with China, ASEAN at that time for this purpose had a sort of united front with China and also with the US. Every year the vote to keep the Khmer Rouge representative at the UN increased because active diplomacy on the part of... there's a sort of irony in this, and that is the Khmer Rouge were a genocidal regime. They killed about 500,000 Cambodians or more. The estimates vary. And yet the international community was supporting them against the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. But as far as Singapore and ASEAN saw it, yes, it was very sad that the Khmer Rouge had done that, but to the rest of Southeast Asia, the principle of inviolability of international frontiers through aggression, inviolability of international frontiers was more important. In other words, if Vietnam could get away with aggression against another country, overthrowing the government through military force, if they could get away with that, what kind of precedent would this set? In the future, another country in Southeast Asia or outside Southeast Asia may invade a country here, in this region. So this principle was paramount. So ASEAN diplomats and ASEAN gained a lot of experience in the United Nations, non-aligned movement fighting for this cause. The war ended with the Paris Peace Accords. What brought an end to the Cambodian conflict? Well, the main reason, the Vietnamese from 1978 to 1989 or 11, 12 years, they fought the insurgency war in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge insurgents were supported by arms by China and Thailand. Thailand and China cooperated. China sent military advisors and weapons to Thai bases, and the two together funneled this aid to the Khmer Rouge so that they could keep up the fight against the Vietnamese occupation. So Vietnam for 11 years fought this insurgency war, at the same time protected its borders from China. It was a huge effort. How did they manage to sustain it? Because of billions of dollars of aid, military aid and financial aid for the Soviet Union. But when Gorbachev came into power and decided to end the Cold War, all this stopped. Without that aid from the Soviet Union every year, Vietnam could not sustain its occupation of Cambodia. So the settlement came with the Paris Peace Accords, which were supervised by the 5 permanent members of the United Nations. In other words, all the big powers agreed. Vietnam agreed to withdraw its forces from Cambodia, and the United Nations, there was a United Nations peacekeeping force for a while to separate the contending parties who had been fighting, and it was agreed to set up a government which is a democratic government, have elections and set up a democratic government. But as happened, I think in the elections, the Prince Ranarith, who was Sihanouk's son, his party came in first. Hun Sen's party came in as narrow second. But in the end, some years later, Hun Sen mounted a coup and took over the power, and he's still in charge today. So that's what happened. And Vietnam had no choice but to come to terms with China. So today, Vietnam is very different from what Vietnam was when they first conquered South Vietnam. They were very proud, they were very arrogant. Now they are much nicer. Now China has become so powerful, that they are afraid of China. So they came to a settlement with China at a meeting between Vietnam and China in Chengdu, China in 1990. And China made certain demands, and which the Vietnamese agreed to, including removing from the Vietnamese Politburo some people whom China considered to be very anti-China. Vietnam removed them. So my next, some lessons from the Indochina conflict. You see, big powers use smaller countries for their proxy wars. Well, here the first small country was Vietnam, later Cambodia. But they had their own reasons to fight, because they wanted unity of their country and independence for their country. The rest of the world, the US and others, opposed it because they happened to be communist. So they had to fight a war for 30 years, from 1945, how long? Up to 1990 virtually. 30, 40 years. That's why one of the Vietnamese prime ministers later, when Vietnam had become tame and nice, he visited Singapore for the first time. I don't know which one it was. He saw Singapore for the first time, and with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, tears came to his eyes, He was so sad. He said, look, he was so impressed with Singapore's buildings and roads and everything. Tears came in. He said, look, if we had not fought a war for 30 years, we would have also advanced. Now we are so far behind because of continuous war. And you see, China and Russia, Vietnam's allies, according to the Vietnamese, they played them out in 1954 because of their own strategic interests. Because they wanted some tactical dealings with the US and the West. So they pressurized Vietnam to divide the country into two, pressurize Hanoi. Even the United States, when ASEAN was active in the 1980s over Cambodia, diplomacy over Cambodia, ASEAN was proposing that the successor government to the puppet government should not include the Khmer Rouge. Should not include the Khmer Rouge because the Khmer Rouge had been so genocidal. So, when ASEAN proposed this, I think one of the Singapore diplomats to the relevant American diplomats, he was very angry. He said, don't carry this further or blood will flow on the floor, something like that. So they were determined to bleed Vietnam in de facto alliance with China. So you see, alliances also change and shift depending upon national interests of the countries. So we can't rely on the words of big powers all the time. It depends on what their interests are. Or finally, I was asked to, shall I continue a little bit? It's already what an hour. Well, I'll wrap up. I was asked to say something about the present balance of power in Asia. I would say China has risen phenomenally. In 2001, China's GDP, the economy, was only about 1.2 trillion US dollars in 2000. By 2011, it was over 7 trillion. Six-fold increase in 10 years. Today is about 13 trillion. The US is about 20 trillion. So its economic power has grown so fast. And by present indications, by the early 2030s, it will surpass the US in GDP size. And its military has also made tremendous advances. So it has narrowed the gap with the US, but not closed it yet, because now China's economy is going to slow down, partly because it's reaching a more mature level. It's not going to be 9-10% growth every year as in the past. Now it's only 6+, but after this trade war with the US and all sorts of US restrictions are coming, more are coming. It may be 5% next year. But still, by the early 2030s, in US dollar terms, it will probably match the US economy. But that does not automatically mean that it is as comprehensively advanced as the US. Today, China is still a middle-income country. Its per capita GDP is the same as Malaysia's, about $10,000 per capita. To be a rich country, advanced country, I think it's about 20,000 or something. So it has still a long way to go. The US is about 50 or 60,000 per capita. So China will overtake the US in GDP because the population is 4 times bigger. Does not necessarily mean that it's comprehensively as advanced as the US.
Same with the military. China has made great strides in its military,
But the US still has some advantages. One is the US has got worldwide bases. It has got military bases in Japan, in Philippines, in the Indian Ocean, in the Middle East, in Germany, Britain, everywhere. So you can always bring it. China has no foreign bases. It's looking for them. Now he realizes it needs foreign bases. He's building one at Djibouti. Djibouti belongs to, I think Djibouti. Near the Horn of Africa. Huh? Secondly, the US has got many allies. Some are powerful countries like Japan, Australia. India is not an ally, but now a close partner. The European countries. China so far has no ally. Oh, it's working closely with Russia now. But otherwise, no ally. So there are some, and in terms of the Chinese military has no combat experience. The US military has got plenty of combat experience. And in operational terms, you know, in modernization of the military, China has still some way to go. But we must remember that the US military is deployed globally. China can concentrate in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So that gives it a big advantage. You know, it can concentrate its forces. So China has advanced a lot. So the balance of power has been shifting in favor of China. I mean, the gap has been narrowing. But most experts think that if you look at the whole Indo-Pacific region, you know, the new term, you know, now is the Indo-Pacific, stretching from the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, all the way to Japan in the northeast, China will find it very difficult to dominate this whole region because it's very big, and also there are some substantial powers like Japan, India. It will be very difficult for it to dominate this. But in Southeast Asia, it has advantages because of proximity, and the countries here are much smaller and weaker militarily and economically. So I think on the longer term, is my view, neither the US nor China will be able to dominate the whole region. The US has been dominating it ever since the end of the Second World War. You know? Now no more, it will not be possible because of the rise of China. Neither side will probably be dominating it, but in Southeast Asia, China has an advantage because of proximity. So while in the whole region, there will probably be a balance of power in the end, but in Southeast Asia, I don't know whether there can be a proper balance, because there may not be a balance in the northern part of Southeast Asia. There may not be, because it's too close to China. Yeah? Southern part, maritime, Southeast Asia may be possible. So I'll just sum that up that way. Yeah.
We're moving on to the Q&A session right now. Thank you, Mr. Daljeet Singh, for the very insightful lecture. I think we've given you a very huge challenge, asking you to talk about the Cold War, ASEAN, Vietnam, and Cambodia all at the same time. And I think 1 hour is hardly enough to cover that. So I think one thing very important is we're trying to approach this lecture from a very historical perspective this time round, slightly different from the first 2 lectures if you've attended. And but we've titled this Echoes of the Cold War. Right at the beginning, you did mention that the term, the new Cold War, has become kind of fashionable and people are talking about it, and you said not yet. So maybe this is a food for thought for some, the people over here raising questions you might want to ask about that. And I think when we're looking at Vietnam and Cambodia, Vietnam's historical role in Cambodia right now is still at the forefront sometimes, especially domestically. Sometimes when events happen, even in Singapore recently, we had the discussion. So I think I'll just open the floor. Open up to questions from the audience, but I think for Mr. Daljeet Singh, if any time you want to address any of the points that I mentioned just now, please feel free to. Yeah, any questions from anyone?
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your talk. Oh, that was very insightful. In your last slide, you mentioned about the power between U.S. and China and the lessons learned from the past. Probably, I have two questions. The first question is, you mentioned about two powers amidst the power between U.S. and China, economically and militarily. I think there's another power. China is far behind the U.S. is the leadership power, because the U.S. can easily align with other countries help with alliance to fight with other countries. The U.S. can fight the war with a few countries at the same time, but is China capable to fight a war with a few countries at the same time? And the U.S. can align with other countries, can lead other countries to fight with other countries. But if China has that leadership to align with the other countries, or to fight with other, either with, I don't know, with other, let's say if there's a war.
China, you see, the countries aligned with China 100% today is Pakistan, one. But Pakistan does not have a significant navy. Of course, Russia is aligned with China, and that has been very helpful to China, because China has been able to get quite a lot of advanced military technology from Russia. Now, this certainly increases the challenge to the West, the Russia-China combination. The interesting thing is, I think the Russians know that long term, China is a threat to Russia, because parts of what is Siberia today one time belonged to China, and Imperial Russia had annexed them from China. So also a lot of Siberia is empty, not much population, so it will be very easy, very vulnerable. So Russia is very much aware of the longer term danger for China. But yet President Putin has decided to align himself with China now, because I don't know whether his calculation is correct or not, he's very afraid of Orange Revolution. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia opened up, he found a lot of Western NGOs and other organizations promoting democracy. He felt that his power and regime were under threat. And he also felt betrayed by the West, because according to the Russians, the West had agreed when the Cold War ended not to expand NATO to areas which were formerly part of Soviet sphere of influence. And yet NATO was expanded to include Poland, Czech Republic, and even the Baltic states. And even there was talk even of Georgia at one time becoming a member of NATO. So Putin was so he has decided that the immediate threat from the West to him was much greater than the long-term threat from China, which can be handled later. So there is at least a tactical alliance. They're very close now. Apart from Russia and Pakistan, North Korea is neither here nor there. North Korea and China still have a military alliance, dating back to the Korean War. They still have a military, but it's more on paper. It's not. I don't think so. The North Koreans don't like China. Nor do they like. Yeah, they don't. And so, of course, China wants allies. It has a very clever strategy of neutralizing countries, like in Southeast Asia and other places, even in Eastern Europe. There are countries which were close to the West, but China, by giving them a lot of economic aid and building through the Belt and Road Initiative and all sorts of things, has made them dependent on itself, on China, especially the weaker countries in Africa and Asia. So, like in Southeast Asia today, most countries would not want to ally with the US. They want to remain neutral. They want to benefit from both sides, Even that's the case with Indonesia, with Malaysia, to some extent even Singapore, even though we have a defense agreement with the US. We want to both sides. So China has succeeded in doing this, that no country is really turns against it because the economic advantages it derives by being close from China. So that is quite effective. But allies, no. So far, no. Apart from those I have mentioned to you. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Okay, I think he has a second question as well.
The second question is about, you mentioned about the slides. The big powers have follow their own interest, and the small countries should be united. So let's take an example of a China South Sea. With China,
Sea, is it?
yes, and have few countries claim about that parts. So, given the relationship between China with the members of ASEAN, in ASEAN, the heterogeneous of the society. So do you think how strong of the relationship within ASEAN to be united against China?
All the countries of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN, know that what China has done in the South China Sea is illegal and bad. But China has become so powerful, and trade and economic ties with China are so important that they dare not condemn China in public. So they still want to. So that's the situation now. So ASEAN statements are there, but they are not as strong as ideally we would want them to be. And also, China has got in ASEAN, I should have mentioned this, Cambodia has become a sort of political ally of China, up to a degree, not completely. So China uses Cambodia to veto any strong statements within ASEAN on the South China Sea. Because ASEAN operates by consensus, all 10 countries must agree to anything. And China has succeeded in doing this same thing in the European Union also. Because over the South China Sea, the European Union wanted to issue a strong statement. But there are 2 or 3 countries, Greece is one of them, because Greece is getting a lot of investments from China, and Chinese have bought one important port in Greece. Greece and one other country, they have always vetoed strong statements within the European Union. So the statements against China on the South China Sea are not strong. But individual countries, of course, European countries like Britain, France, Germany, individual countries have issued strong statements. So that's the position with regard to the South China Sea. Now, there are talks going on between ASEAN and China on the South China Sea on a code of conduct for the South China Sea. Now, China wants them to agree to certain things which, if ASEAN countries agree to, will make South China Sea a Chinese lake. like a closed sphere of influence. Like foreign militaries, you can't exercise, have naval or military exercises in the South China Sea with foreign military powers unless all countries agree. All means including China. So it has a veto power. So if ASEAN agrees to all this, which I think ASEAN won't, then, South China Sea really becomes a closed sphere of China. But the outside powers will still operate in the South China Sea. They are quite determined too, The Western countries, their navies are operating in the South China Sea. So that's the position with regard to ASEAN and China on the South China Sea, okay?
To follow up from that question, two questions. Do you think that from China's perspective, would there come a day that they will commit to some form of a Monroe Doctrine with regard to the South China Sea dispute? That's number one. And number two, do you think that with the larger historical context of understanding China and Southeast Asian relation, do you think that the One Belt, One Road strategy or initiative is the opening act of the Chinanization of Southeast Asia, similar to the Sovietization of Eastern Europe after 1945, especially with the initiation of Comecon by the Soviet Union, which is quite similar in terms of an economic alliance to the One Belt, One Road strategy. So in light of this, what do you think is the geopolitical implications for China and for Southeast Asia specific to the One Belt, One Road relationship? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the second question first. Well, the Belt and Road Initiative is a very ambitious one. It is presented as an economic initiative. It is economic, but it's also more than economic, because within it there are also levers for political and strategic influence. The ultimate idea is that China builds infrastructure, gives economic development aid, and then these countries export to China and import from China. So you have all roads going to Beijing. It's creating a new sphere of influence. There is that element, of course. But as you would have read from newspaper reports, the Chinese have encountered some difficulties, things like debt trap. I mean, the terms of loans that they're giving are not that great, not good. I mean, they say, okay, you can start repaying only in 10 years' time. So countries are very happy, But then the interest rates are so high in 10 years' time. And so many countries in Africa and Asia, the leaders have been given money, bribed, like in Sri Lanka. So they accepted all this. Now, what I'm saying is that the Belt and Road can genuinely help in the development of quite a number of these countries, provided these countries remain wary about not becoming over-dependent on China. But Japan is also into the act of infrastructure building. Japan is competing with China and Indonesia. In fact, Japan has got more infrastructure investments in Indonesia than China. Japan is competing with China. And even in Thailand, Japan is trying to, but Japan alone cannot compete with China, because China is too big, because so much money. The other countries of the West, especially the US, Australia, now trying to see how they can combine with Japan and maybe even one or two European countries to provide infrastructure development for this part of the world. Because the problem is, at the moment, there's no alternative to the Chinese BRI. China helps you to build infrastructure. There's no alternative apart from Japan. But Japan cannot match China. So I think slowly an alternative will emerge. So it is not necessarily the case that the whole region will become a sort of China dominated because of BRI. It may happen to some parts of the region for other factors, maybe military, maybe economic dependence, just BRI. But certainly BRI helps China's strategic ambitions. I don't deny that. Now, what was your first question? Monroe Doctrine, isn't it? Huh?
Monroe Doctrine.
Oh yeah, China has no doubt about it. It wants to impose a Monroe Doctrine on Southeast Asia. The argument is simple. They feel that foreign powers like US and others are a threat to them. And so they must have a secure area of influence. Just like the Americans had in Latin America in the 19th century and up to about the middle of the 20th century. After that, much less so. So when we discuss with the Chinese, we tell them, oh yes, the Americans did that, but that is history. That was an old way of thinking. This is the 21st century, and you don't have to do this now, you know, and this will not be acceptable today. So whether it registers on them or not, I don't know.
Thank you, Professor. My question is, would you characterize ASEAN as a set of partnerships between the governments of Southeast Asian nations or the actual nations of Southeast Asia? The reason why I'm asking is, in order to protect like abstract ideas such as sovereignty and territorial integrity, Southeast Asian leaders were willing to ignore the tangible suffering of people in Cambodia during the Cambodian genocide. So do you think this has moral implications for our future as a region, and actually do you think this is even important to like consider?
Well, it's more than just talks between leaders. You know, ASEAN has done quite a lot to secure peace and stability within Southeast Asia, which helps everyone, you know. So Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN members have not had a war since ASEAN was formed because of close relations. So that helps everybody, including the common people. Now, ASEAN economic initiatives will eventually help also everybody, because the economic initiatives are designed to accelerate economic growth in ASEAN countries. But ASEAN also has a social and cultural program to get the peoples of Southeast Asia closer together. There are so many things going on, parliamentarians, youth, and all kinds of things. Now, I agree with you that the impact on the general publics of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN members, has been less than we would wish. But they are making efforts to do that. So that would be my answer. There is a deficit there, but they are trying to overcome it.
My question is, do you think the whole world can be united as one nation, one people, one day in the future? If yes, why? And if no, why?
All countries united into one.
Do you mean the whole of ASEAN or?
No, the whole world.
The whole world. That's a huge question.
You know, that would be very good if it could happen. If we have one world government, then probably a lot of the conflicts and problems will disappear. But still, you will still have problems of poverty, and you could still have clashes between citizens of different races. You still could have domestic problems. But at least you won't have wars between countries if you have world government. But that's very far away. Nationalism is still very strong in most countries. Nationalism, national identity, ethnic identity, These things, in fact, are becoming worse now instead of improving.
Could I ask for your views on the nature of the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia and how that might have affected the ASEAN nations' diplomacy with regard to the issue as a whole?
ASEAN was affected, and ASEAN diplomacy was affected more by the invasion and occupation. Not so much about what they did, not by what they did during their occupation. It was the invasion itself and then the occupation which affected ASEAN, because ASEAN felt this should not be tolerated. The international community should not tolerate it. So Thailand was the most exposed because you had Vietnamese army on Thailand's borders at that time. So Thailand was the most worried and most anxious to make sure that the international community opposed it. But I think Singapore was the second strongest advocate for this, because we are a small country with big neighbors nearby, and we didn't want a precedent set that a country invades and occupies another country and then just gets away with it, So that was the issue. Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, well, all the time they had to fight the Khmer Rouge, who were mounting a guerrilla warfare against them, supported by China and Thailand, Otherwise, it was okay. They ended the genocide of the Khmer Rouge. That's why recently, when our Prime Minister made his remarks when General Prem passed away, and also at the Shangri-La dialogue, he referred to Vietnam's aggression, was it?
I think he mentioned
invasion and occupation, I think in a sort of negative way, and also installing a puppet government in Cambodia. The Cambodians were very unhappy with the present government in Cambodia. Because now we have very good relations. Singapore has very good relations with both Vietnam and Cambodia, especially with Vietnam. There are a lot of Singapore investments in Vietnam, and they are growing. And the Vietnamese leaders trust Singapore. Singapore's investments and considered Singapore a very trustworthy country. So relationships are very warm. And also with Cambodia, although somewhat less. So for Hun Sen to be called, because Hun Sen was the leader of Cambodia at that time, to be called a puppet, part of a puppet government, although not directly by name, they were offended. So this you can debate, As far as we are concerned, I suppose what the Prime Minister meant was, well, it was Vietnam who carried out the invasion and occupation. So it was Vietnamese aggression. Because Vietnam was a different Vietnam those days. Today is a different Vietnam. So that's the way he looked at it.
Do you consider Myanmar as a potential ally of China? Because Myanmar is very important to China strategically, right? It is like China underbelly. So with so-called Myanmar tied to China as an ally, she will have a lot of safe margin against India, because next to Myanmar is India. Yeah. So, but I think recently Myanmar is a bit unhappy because the BRI a lot of projects. They are having a lot of project issue now because cannot pay. I think they either cannot pay or they want to delay or what. So, but what do you think? Will Myanmar eventually like become as close to China like Cambodia?
It's a different situation from Cambodia's situation. You see, Myanmar has got a habit of shooting itself in the foot. you know. I mean, it became, it came out of military rule and has a civilian government, although the military still has influence. And part of the reason for doing that was it didn't like over-dependence on China under military rule. But to grow the economy, they need support from the Western countries. Investments, not just China. Otherwise, they don't get the support from the Western countries, Europe especially, and the US and Japan. If you don't get support from them, then you become over-dependent on China again. So, but because of the way they dealt with the Rohingyas, now they're having trouble with the Western countries who are very hesitant to support them. So they find themselves falling into China's arms. Not entirely, but that's the direction. No, they don't like the Chinese. You see, in Cambodia it's different because, of course, the Cambodians also, they don't like the high-profile Chinese in Cambodia. But generally the Cambodian and Laotian population, okay lah with China. But the Burmese people hate China. So the public is very anti-China. But they have no choice but to depend on China because of economic support. And Myanmar has become strategically very important, because it's one place through which the Middle East oil for China, one of the routes, they have pipeline carrying the oil to Yunnan province from Myanmar. So it's very important strategically. And therefore the India, Australia, US, they also make sure that they have naval exercises in the Bay of Bengal. So if there's war, that will be a major theater of conflict, including Myanmar. So that's the situation for Myanmar. Very unfortunate. Ideally, if they were clever, they should, or they don't want to align with anybody. They want to be neutral. So, but to be neutral, you have to have good relations with the major powers. You can't annoy them too much, like they have annoyed the West, you see. Then they can have relations with China, with India, with Europe, with the US, try to balance them. That's the best.
As an ending note, I was wondering if you can just share, go back to the first point that you made, that we're not seeing a new Cold War yet. As an ending note, why so, and what are some of your observations?
Well, I say it's not yet Cold War because, as I said at the beginning of my talk, in a Cold War you try to weaken or destroy your adversary by all means short of fighting with him, by subversion, by proxy wars. That I think, at least from the US side, they are not supporting insurgencies in China's allies. It hasn't reached that stage. At the moment, it's mostly economic and financial. At the moment. One day it may reach Cold War. But the thinking has become, although the actions don't reach the point of Cold War, the thinking is becoming like Cold War thinking.